Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you. So if you just take your seats, thank you. Good morning and welcome to Gateway Vineyard. My name's Sarah. A really big welcome, especially if this is your first time with us today. So make yourselves at home and pick up a welcome bag from the foyer at the end of the service. If you're new at Gateway, or this is your church family, but you're just connecting with us on Sunday mornings at the moment, and we'd really like to invite you further into community with us. So that means living generously and making a difference to those around us. And you can find out ways you can get involved on Sundays or midweek by speaking to us in the foyer after the service, or filling out a join the team card, which has all the different options on the back, and they're available in the foyer too. Now, if Gateway is your home church, we also invite you to be part of the family by giving regularly. You can do this online, and there's a short link for that, and that goes gtwy.ch/give, or by using the giving envelopes or gift aid forms and offering box which are in the foyer. Now, some announcements of things coming up. We have a Hope Explored course. Now, that's beginning on the 4th of August at the chapel site. And it's a 3-week course that looks into where we can find hope, peace, and purpose in today's world. So it's a real exploratory course for those fairly new to Christianity or wanting to know more about Christianity. And all are welcome to come along. You can sign up via the life group page on the website. So that's via gtwy.ch/LG, standing for life groups. And I will be in contact with more details, or come and speak to me after the service if you'd like to. If you're interested in that in any way, either helping with it or taking part in it, or know somebody who might like to take part in it. We also have a team of older people's volunteers and who are able and willing to connect with anyone who needs a visit or a phone call, either as a one-off thing if they're unwell, or as a longer-term thing with regular visits. Now, if you know of anyone that would benefit from those calls or visits, or who might like to be on the team, it might be you, it might be someone you know, please do come and speak to me after the service. Or you can contact me via my email address, which is sarahhousden@gatewayvineyard.church. I know it. Okay, we're also planning to launch another Alpha group in the autumn, which begins in October. Alpha is an introductory course into the Christian faith through a series of talks and discussions. We're looking for a team who can help with setup, cooking meals, production, hosting, and prayer. So if you'd be interested in joining the team or want to come as a guest, please visit gtwy.ch/alpha. Brilliant, you've got it, to sign up. And please also be praying about who you could invite to Alpha, because we've all got people that we'd like to introduce to Jesus. Now, that's the notices, but Trevor, our friend Trevor Johnson, is going to come and talk to us with a quick testimony.
Come here. So, hang on, Joe. Yeah, my name's Trevor. Some of you know me, some of you don't, but that's me. Yeah, and I got to put this right in my mouth. So, basically, this sort of story is about a friend of mine called Pat. We worked together with, it was 5 of us in this little group, and I gave the other 4 a Bible. And Pat said, "You take hers," she said, "because I gave it to her, in spite of the fact she was a communist and a staunch atheist." And then she took it. And she'd retired, and later I retired, and she came to my retirement. And she said, "I've still got that Bible." I said, "Oh, that's very good." I was very pleased about that. And that was that. And then sometime later, I was sitting at home, and the knock came in the door, and there stood my niece, Susan. She said, "I got a message for you from Pat Blanchard." Yeah, she said, her and her husband came to our church, So they're looking for a church to come to, which is City Church in Nelson Street at the time. And she said, but we are commoners and we are atheists. Anyway, I said, well, you're welcome to come to church. So they came. But she said, in a very short time, they both became committed Christians. And Pat involved herself in administration, and Chris, her husband, was a sort of adventures on hand sort of man. You got to do things. So he went and joined the soup team and went out in the evenings to look after the people who lived in the street. And then not only that, he brought some of them to church. And on one occasion, he brought children to church. And the room went round and wondered what Christian, who has he got to bring this time? But anyway, that was a delightful story, and that was a wonderful one. And, when you do little things for God, you might think, oh, I can't do that. But you can, because it doesn't take too much. Sometimes they say, no, thank you. I'm fine. You just walk away and say, thank you very much, and goodbye. But, sometimes you think, well, I still can't do that. Well, if you want encouragement, I suggest you read Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 and 30, and there you'll find some wonderful words of encouragement. And life is not as difficult as you think it is. Anyway, thank you for listening.
Thank you to Trevor there. Thank you so much. And Trevor's been so faithful through the years in sharing Bibles with people. I'll just pray for Mark now before he comes and speaks with us. Okay, so Holy Spirit, we just pray that you come now and anoint Mark and speak to all of us, Lord, as we listen to his words. And I pray for your blessing on Mark and on each of us as you open our ears and eyes to hear you, to see you, and to know you working in our lives, Lord. Amen.
We on? Can you hear me? Yeah? No? Yes. There we go. I can hear me. Echoing a little bit. Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, those in the room. Good morning to those at Central watching, and good morning to those watching at home, and afternoon if you're catching up later. It is great to be together. It's a shame it's not like a two-way stream into Central that we'd be able to see you and you'd be able to see all of us. But it's great to be together as one church meeting in different locations this morning. During August, we're all going to be together at Central. There'll be no Sunday morning gatherings here at the chapel for the 4 Sundays in August. And this is a great opportunity for us all to be in the same place at the same time, worshipping and serving together. So I really want to encourage you to prioritize joining in throughout August if you are around in Norwich and not jet setting off somewhere lovely. Well, this morning we wanted to be together because we're launching our new teaching series. We've spent the last 4 months looking at questions that Jesus asked, which has been brilliant, and you can catch up on all of that online. But we're going to spend the summer weeks based in the Gospel of John, looking at the signs of the kingdom that John writes about. So I want to encourage you over these summer weeks to be reading and rereading the book of John, and ask the Holy Spirit to teach you and show you things in a new way, in a deeper way that maybe you previously hadn't understood or seen. But I also want to encourage you, if you're in the room here or at Central today, or you're watching online, and you're exploring who Jesus is and what that means for you personally, then we want you to know you're really welcome. This is a great place for you to be. You're welcome to come with your questions and journey that with us. And I'd really encourage you, stick around over these next 7 weeks or so as we unpack each of these signs, because I think it could be really helpful for you in your journey. Equally, get involved with Hope Explored or sign up for Alpha launching in October, where again you can explore and ask more questions for yourself. And over the coming weeks, you're going to hear from different speakers. Each will unpack a different sign in John's Gospel each week. But today, I want to paint a bit of a backdrop or build a foundation for the rest of the series. And so we're going to zoom out a little bit and look at the context of John's Gospel and what he was trying to communicate through these different signs. Now, John's Gospel is somewhat different. I don't know if you've got other slides. We'll come. There we go. John's Gospel is somewhat different to the first three Gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the New Testament. Those three are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. They're called synoptic because they see together with a common view. The word synoptic literally means together and sight. If you think optic for vision, so together, sight. So they have lots and lots of similarities. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they cover many of the same events in Jesus' life, and most of them from Jesus' ministry in Galilee in particular. And they follow much the same order in those three books. Nearly 90% of Mark's content is found in Matthew's Gospel, and about 50% of Mark's content appears in Luke. And all of the parables of Christ are found in the Synoptic Gospels. But there are some differences between those three Gospels too. Matthew and Luke are both considerably longer than Mark. Matthew was written for a Jewish audience, Mark for a Roman audience, and Luke for a broader, unique to his gospel. You won't find that specific phrase anywhere else in the Bible. Luke places a definite emphasis on Jesus' acts of compassion towards Gentiles and Samaritans, and much of Luke chapters 10 to 20 are unique to that gospel. Now, John's Gospel is interesting because it doesn't include a lot of material that you would find in the Synoptic Gospels, including some really surprising and important events and episodes in the life of Jesus. So John's Gospel doesn't include anything about his birth, doesn't include anything about the temptation of Jesus, Jesus' transfiguration, the institution of the Lord's Supper. None of them are mentioned in John's Gospel. John doesn't mention any examples of Jesus casting out demons from people, and the Sermon on the Mount and the Lord's Prayer are also not found in John's Gospel either. And there are no narrative parables in John's Gospel. There are, however, various themes that run through John's Gospel and are much more apparent than in the other ones. So themes like good versus evil, light versus darkness, Jesus sent by God from heaven to earth are strong themes, and they're all underpinned by a theme of God's love. Whilst there are some differences, there are some similarities. They're not completely separate between those three synoptic gospels and John's gospel. John's basic story is the same. Israel's Messiah is announced by John the Baptist. He teaches, works miracles, runs into conflict with religious leaders, gets arrested and tried by Jewish and Roman officials, is crucified, but is resurrected from the dead. There are some overlapping events too between John's gospel and the synoptic. So John the Baptist's ministry overlaps. The feeding of over 5,000 people is an account that overlaps as well. And Jesus walking on water and his friendship with Mary and Martha of Bethany, and many other examples. John's Gospel can often be considered to actually be two books in one, the way it's written. The first 12 chapters are known as the Book of Signs, whilst the last chapters 13 to 20 reference the Book of Glory, which focuses on the Lord's imminent crucifixion. It features lengthy dialogues between Jesus and his disciples, which is quite a contrast to the others. Now, I'd say if you want a concise overview of any book in the Bible, but particularly John as we start this series, I'd really recommend searching for the Bible Project online. And they have these animated videos. Someone describes and they draw, it's really clever, of each book of the Bible that gives you that overarching view of each book that really helps as you're reading it to see how does this fit in? What are the big themes that sometimes you can miss when you're just reading particular passages? So have a look at that. John's Gospel is split into two videos. The first half, the Book of Signs, and the second half, the Book of Glory. And he describes that and knits it all together. I say he, it's a big team of people who put that together. So, bit of a whistle-stop tour there of the Book of John and what makes it unique. So now we want to get a closer look at the term that John uniquely uses in his gospel throughout when he's referring to miraculous and poignant works of Jesus, because he calls them signs, and that is unique to John's gospel. For this series, we're going to be focusing on the 7 signs recorded in John's gospel. Now, by definition, a sign points to something beyond itself. Okay? Now, I've spent longer than I care to admit to you looking online at Google at interesting, confusing, and funny signs. You don't need to know how long that was. You just need to know it was far longer than I should have spent looking at that. I've always had a little bit of a sense of humor when it comes to funny signs. But some local context and advance warning for you. If you're trying to get to the chapel site or you're driving anywhere near Hellesdon for the next 8 weeks, expect diversion signs. Because we've got roadworks happening at the boundary junction. It's a nightmare getting anywhere. And so you will be sent all over the place with signs. I heard a story this week from someone who had a friend who once followed diversion signs and found they just went in a loop and kept getting back to where they'd started. So either a young person had twisted one of those signs to keep going left, or they just weren't put out very well. But you might see signs like this. I particularly enjoyed the secret bunker sign that directed people to the secret nuclear bunker. It's clear. It points to something that probably shouldn't be pointed to. But a few months ago, I was visiting my parents. They've moved to Essex, and I had some time by myself as the kids were entertained. And so I went out, and I had to stop by this big Tesco. I'd never been there before, and it's a weird setup. You kind of drive, the roads are higher than Tesco sort of sunk down. And so as you drive in into this massive car park that sits underneath a motorway, I was trying to work out from the car park, how do I get into the Tesco? So I went to what looked like, in the middle of the building, these big doors that looked like the most obvious entrance. And as I got to those doors, I came across this sign that says, sorry, these doors are currently closed. Sorry for any inconvenience. It's like, okay, so where's the entrance? And so I'm looking, I'm like, where are other people going? And so I saw some people walking to the right, and I was like, well, that's sort of, that end of the building's in the middle of the car park. That would make sense. It's the quickest way to get in. So I walked down there. No, that's the loading bay. So it's like, how do I get into this building? I want to buy some stuff. You're making it so difficult. And so I asked somebody, and they were like, it's down that end, mate. I was like, okay, thank you. When I got there, I was like, oh, yeah, there's a big Tesco sign here. I guess that makes sense. But I couldn't see it from where I was. So I thought I'd be helpful. I'll give some feedback. So I went to customer services, found a nice young man who's behind the counter. I queued up. I was patient. And I said, look, I just want to give you a little feedback. It's my first time to your store. I actually found it quite challenging to find the way in. Now, he looked at me and he thought, I don't know if he's having a bad day or he just thought, are you the dumbest person I'm going to meet today? Because, like, everyone else clearly found their way into this shop. Like, why couldn't you see the entrance? So I kind of took a hit on my pride. I said, well, I just want to give you some feedback. You know, there's human factors. And maybe just a piece of advice, maybe your sign could just be a little clearer, just a little bit more information that says, sorry, these doors are currently closed. Your nearest entrance is to the left. And put an arrow for those who don't know their left and right. Just it's that way. Would have been so much more helpful. I could have walked there and then been like, okay, the entrance is here. I suspect that exact sign is still on that door. And new people, maybe it's just me, but maybe some new people are also struggling to get into the Tesco in that place. The sign they put up only gave me half the information I needed. For a sign to be useful, it's got to direct the reader of the sign to the destination. And that is exactly what John's gospel is doing as he highlights these 7 signs throughout his gospel in the first half of it that points us in a very specific direction. This distinctive feature in John's gospel is the use of a Greek word semeia, or sign, instead of miracle, as all the other gospel writers used. So we've got to assume this wasn't an accident. John does this on purpose, and he's trying to help us to understand that these works performed by Jesus were not just supernatural kind of miracles, but they were intentional signs directing us to something else. In the Old Testament, there's about 120 references to signs. Most of them are found in groupings linked to Moses and then the prophets. These often involve supernatural events, sometimes through a specific human servant. But if we look in Exodus at Moses, there were many signs and wonders performed through Moses, including the 10 plagues of Egypt, as he leads the Israelites out of captivity in Egypt and into the promised land. But not all signs in the Old Testament were miraculous in that kind of way. For example, in Isaiah 20, the prophet Isaiah says walks naked and barefoot for 3 years as a sign and warning against Egypt and Cush. Have no fear. I have no intention of following Isaiah's precedent of walking around Hellesdon naked as a sign to Norwich, unless, well, if the Lord's going to have to speak very, very specifically. But that's a whole other point, and we're not going to do that. In Ezekiel 4, there's a prophetic sign using an iron pan, which is random, to say the least. So whilst the power of signs may have seen a gradual shift from a miraculous nature of signs with Moses to a more symbolic and prophetic nature in the prophets, these signs all served a purpose, which was to authenticate God's appointed messenger, which therefore authenticates the message they brought to the people as being divine, from God. The signs were the evidence this person is from God with my authority speaking a message of God. You should pay attention to this. That was the purpose. In Exodus 4, verse 5, this is the Lord speaking to Moses, said, "This, said the Lord, is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." Goes on in verse 8 and 9. Then the Lord said, "If they do not believe you or pay attention to the first sign," the stick turned into a snake, "they may believe the second," putting his hand in his coat and it turning out leprous and putting it back and it gets fixed again. "But if they do not believe these 2 signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground." The signs John includes are intentional, and a number of them have similarities to the signs performed by God's first prophet Moses in Exodus, whilst others are more symbolic and prophetic. So for an event to be classed as a sign in John's gospel, it doesn't necessarily need to be a miracle. John was particularly keen on the number 7. As you read through his book, it represents completeness in Hebrew, and John includes these 7 signs that we're going to focus on, but also 7 I am statements of Jesus. I am the bread of life, etc. He includes 7 witnesses that Jesus is the Messiah. 7 feasts are mentioned as Jesus goes back and forward from Jerusalem to the countryside. There are 7 disciples Jesus appears to at the lake after he's resurrected. 7 days are described in the second half of the gospel. And there are 7 questions that Jesus asks, as we've just covered, in John's account. So the 7 signs that we're going to be unpacking in this series are as follows: turning water into wine, cleansing the temple, healing the nobleman's son, healing the lame man, feeding the 5,000, plus a few extras, healing the blind man, and raising Lazarus. Now, that being said, there is some theological debate about the number of signs. Some believe there are only 6. They don't include the cleansing the temple. And that this incomplete number, not quite making it 7, points to the great... They might add in walking on water, for example. However, when you look in closer detail at what constitutes a sign in John's gospel, believe cleansing the temple meets the criteria. You see, a sign points to something beyond itself. So the resurrection of Jesus was the destination. It's not really a sign in itself when it's like, this is what everything else is pointing to. It's also not in the first half as all the others are found. A sign in John's gospel is a public work of Jesus. A sign is something that Jesus does, not merely something he says and something people can see, not merely something they hear. These are events, not just things that Jesus talked about. And these signs were all done in front of people who weren't followers of Jesus. They were public signs, Jews and Gentiles, rather than private events with just his disciples, such as walking on the water was just him and his disciples. And finally, each of the 7 signs are specifically called signs, using the form of that Greek word semeia in the narrative. The only exception in the direct text is the 4th sign, the healing of the nobleman's son. that in the actual story doesn't call it a sign, but it's referenced a little bit later in chapter 7 as a sign as they talk about it. And the cleansing the temple and feeding the 5,000 have a similarity in that the religious leaders ask for a sign from Jesus that he is the Son of God as he's claiming, and Jesus points them back to the thing that he's just done, clearing the temple, feeding the 5,000. That's the sign you're looking for, and so Jesus references those as signs through John's writing. So if John calls each of these a sign, we can understand that he links these signs to one another. They share a common, cumulative, as in they build on each other, and collective purpose. Any one sign on their own may reveal a part of this mission, but when you take them together, the signs provide a complete picture of the Christ who is Jesus. That's John's purpose. So what was this purpose as John details? Remember, a sign points to something beyond itself. And so what are these 7 signs pointing to? Well, helpfully, John tells us at the very end of his book, in John chapter 20, verse 30 to 31. He says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So John acknowledges Jesus did many other signs, but through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and as he writes his gospel towards the end of his life, he curates and chooses these 7 signs for a purpose. Just like the Old Testament signs authenticated the messengers of God, the signs in John's gospel also authenticate Jesus as a divine messenger. But unlike the Old Testament, these signs now also authenticate Jesus as the message, not just the messenger. John starts his gospel with the words, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He's very intentional all the way through, that Jesus isn't just claiming to be a messenger of God. He's declaring through these signs and his words that he is the Son of God. John chapter 10, verse 36 to 38, Jesus says, "Why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's Son? Do not believe me unless I do the works of my Father. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father." As John's gospel goes on, Jesus openly declares that he is the Son of God, and each of these signs authenticate his claim. This enrages the religious leaders. And we see as the signs increase in power, so the controversy surrounding Jesus escalates, and their efforts to close him down, to quiet him, to silence him, and then to crucify him increase. You see, when Jesus performed a sign, he was making the case for who he is, the Messiah that these people were waiting for, and the Son of God. He's come to rescue and set them free. A helpful definition of a sign in John's Gospel comes from this guy, Andreas Kostenberger. Apologies to this man if I mispronounce his name. He's written a whole kind of thesis on the 7 signs of John that I use as part of my research. He says a sign is a symbol-laden, but not necessarily miraculous, public work of Jesus, selected and explicitly identified as such by John for the reason that it displays God's glory in Jesus, who is therefore shown to be God's true representative. You see, John is making a similar case to Jesus in his gospel letter. Like a legal brief in a court of law, John brings witness through each sign, and with each sign building on the last, revealing through the miraculous and the symbolic and prophetic, just in the Old Testament signs, how they operated. John is showing this legal briefing why we should believe in Jesus Christ. John sifted through all the evidence available to him and chose the best evidence for the case he was presenting. These 7 signs reach a climax when Lazarus is raised from the dead, like a closing argument in a court of law that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, with the power to overcome death. After this point, Jesus stops performing any more signs, and concentrates on teaching his closest disciples for the second half of the book and ends his public ministry with the crowds in the way that John writes his book. He also says that many Jews that encountered Jesus at that time failed to read the signs correctly. In John 12, verse 37, it says, even after Jesus had performed many signs in their presence, they still would not believe in him. And it's not just them. Today, people can read or hear this testimony and not believe they're true. The failure to believe in the truth these signs reveals doesn't rest with the inadequacy or the failure of the sign, but rather in the person who fails to read and interpret the signs correctly. These signs John lists aren't like the sign in Tesco's window. They are complete, they are clear, they are for you to then interpret and decide how you follow them. And this fulfills what John started his gospel with. In John chapter 1, verse 9 to 18, there's a chunk of text I'm going to show you and read it for you. He introduces the themes of his book, linking the Old Testament to the New, Moses to Jesus, the Old Covenant to the New Covenant, and light into the darkness. He says this, the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Out of his fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. And so wherever you're at in your journey of faith, whether you're hearing this for the very first time or the 100th time, we want to encourage you to pay close attention over the coming weeks as we unpack each of the 7 signs of the kingdom that John chose to demonstrate and prove that Jesus is the Son of God. This is the central issue at hand for you to decide for yourself. Do you believe Jesus is the Son of God, who died for you to pay the price for your sin and was resurrected to live and overcome the power of death? That's the central bit that this all hinges on. Do you believe Jesus is the Son of God or not? These signs are not the destination. They point to the greater reality of who Jesus is and what he did for you on the cross through his resurrection. And this is true for us today. When we encounter the power and the presence of Jesus in healing, in freedom, in visions, in prophetic words and dreams, these help authenticate the message and the messenger of Jesus when we experience the power of God in our lives. And so if you don't know Jesus as your Savior, our prayer for you is that the Holy Spirit will reveal the truth to you, that you can weigh the evidence put before you like a juror in a trial, and at the end come to a conclusion that Jesus is the Son of God, who died for your sin so that you would want to say yes to his gift of life. As you do that, we'd love to pray with you this morning. We want to support you as you start your adventure of faith in Jesus, or you take steps to explore that. As we've mentioned, join Alpha or the Hope Explored. There are many spaces where you can journey and explore the evidence in the Bible that John and other writers put to help us know who God is and what he's done for us. But I also want to speak to you if you do know Jesus. If you've been following Jesus, you're a disciple of Jesus, you're studying his word, you're trying to live it out, then these next 7 weeks, these 7 signs, can really help us to understand and behold the glory of the Son of God, to gain a deeper and fuller understanding of his glory. That was John's intention. It was twofold, and it's just the same today as it was when he originally wrote this. So we're excited for this series. As I said, I encourage you to read along during the week. Ask the Lord to reveal things as you listen to a talk. Chew on it afterwards. Reread the sign and see what the Lord wants to speak to you specifically about. But we're going to come to a close for this morning with this introduction to our series. But we also want to create space and a chance to respond. So for that, we're going to say goodbye to those at Central. God bless you. We're going to hand over to those in the room with you at Central to lead some time to respond to what the Lord has been doing with you in that space. Also, for those of you watching at home, we're going to sign off from here. And so God bless you as you meet with the Lord in the comfort of your own home, wherever you're watching us from. God bless you. We'd love to see you in the room if you're able to make it over the coming 7 weeks tracking with this series. And then for those of us left in the chapel, as they all kind of sign off, go from there.